metal screamed as Deputy Wilson's bolt cutters bit through the heavy-duty padlock. His hands were shaking. 11 years on the force? And they were shaking. Behind him, 3 other officers stood with weapons drawn, flashlights cutting through the November afternoon shadows that stretched across Todd Kohlhepp's property like grasping fingers. "Faster," Lieutenant Hayes barked. "She's running out of air." 30 seconds earlier, they'd heard it, a sound that shouldn't exist on a property this isolated, this silent, this seemingly abandoned. Bang, bang, bang. Rhythmic, desperate human. "Help me, please, I'm in here." The voice had erupted from inside the rusted shipping container like a gunshot, stopping all 4 officers mid-step. For a split second, nobody moved. They'd come here looking for bodies, for evidence, for the grim confirmation that Kayla Brown and Charlie Carver, missing for 64 days, were dead and buried somewhere on this 100-acre hell. They hadn't come expecting to hear screaming. "Please, he'll come back. Please get me out." Wilson's bolt cutters finally severed the lock. It hit the ground with a dull thud that sounded like a judge's gavel. Hayes grabbed the container door handle, met Wilson's eyes for one terrible moment. "What are we about to find?" and wrenched it open. The smell hit them first. Human waste, decay, fear so thick you could taste it. Then the darkness inside the container seemed to move, and a figure emerged from the shadows. Emaciated, filthy, a chain around her neck catching the light like some medieval torture device. Chained by the neck like an animal was 30-year-old Kayla Brown. She had been missing for 64 days. 64 days of unimaginable horror. 64 days of captivity in a cramped metal box on the property of a man who had presented himself as a successful real estate agent, a pillar of the community. But Todd Kohlhepp was far from what he seemed. And as Kayla emerged from that container, blinking in the November sunlight, trembling and emaciated, she delivered the words that would transform a missing persons case into one of the most horrifying criminal investigations in South Carolina history. "He shot Charlie. He shot Charlie in front of me." The nightmare had only just begun to unfold. Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and the algorithm gods will make sure you don't miss any future uploads. Kayla Brown was 30 years old when her life intersected with evil. Born and raised in South Carolina, Kayla was known to friends and family as a hard-working, resourceful young woman who wasn't afraid to roll up her sleeves and tackle whatever job came her way. In a struggling economy where steady work was increasingly difficult to find, Kayla had built a reputation as someone reliable, someone who would show up, do the work, and ask few questions. She had found sporadic employment doing cleaning and maintenance work for various property owners in the upstate South Carolina region. The jobs weren't glamorous, but they paid the bills. Kayla had cleaned houses, maintained vacant properties, and performed odd jobs for landlords and real estate investors who needed dependable help. She was the kind of person who would text back promptly when work was available, who would arrive on time, and who would leave a property cleaner than she found it. Those who knew Kayla described her as having a warm smile that could light up a room despite the challenges life had thrown her way. She was close with her family, particularly her mother, who worried about her daughter's safety in a world that seemed increasingly unpredictable. Kayla had experienced her share of hardships, financial struggles, relationship difficulties, and the constant pressure of making ends meet in a region where opportunities were scarce. But in 2016, Kayla's life had taken a turn for the better. She had found love. Charles David Carver, known to everyone as Charlie, was 32 years old with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that immediately put people at ease. Charlie was the kind of man who would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. He had struggled with his own demons over the years, including battles with substance abuse that he had been working hard to overcome. Those struggles had been difficult, but Charlie was determined to build a better life for himself. Friends remembered Charlie as someone who loved motorcycles, outdoor adventures, and spending time with the people he cared about. He had a passion for mechanics and had dreams of one day opening his own motorcycle repair shop. It was an ambitious goal, but Charlie was the kind of person who believed in the possibility of redemption, of second chances, of building something meaningful from the ground up. When Charlie met Kayla, something clicked, and they understood each other in a way that only people who have faced real adversity can. They had both been knocked down by life, and they were both fighting to get back up. Their relationship blossomed quickly, built on mutual respect, shared struggles, and genuine affection. By the summer of 2016, they had moved in together, sharing a modest apartment and dreaming about their future. Money was tight. It always was. But they had each other, and that meant everything. Kala continued taking on cleaning jobs wherever she could find them, and Charlie looked for work in mechanics and manual labor. They were scraping by, but they were doing it together, and that gave them hope. It was through Kayla's cleaning work that the couple first encountered Todd Kohlhepp. On the surface, Kohlhepp seemed like a godsend, a successful real estate agent who owned multiple properties throughout the region and always seemed to need help with maintenance and cleaning. He was in his mid-40s, well-dressed and professional in his communications. He drove nice cars, owned a sprawling rural property in Woodruff, and spoke with the confidence of someone who had made something of himself. Kayla had done work for Kohlhepp before, cleaning some of his properties and doing light maintenance. He paid on time, and the work was straightforward. There was something a little odd about him. He could be intense, and there was an unsettling quality to the way he sometimes looked at her. But Kayla needed the money, and Kohlhepp's checks never bounced. What Kayla didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Todd Kohlhepp was a registered sex offender. In 1987, at the age of 15, Kohlhepp had been convicted of kidnapping and sexually assaulting a 14-year-old girl in Arizona. He had served 14 years in prison before being released and eventually relocating to South Carolina. Despite his violent criminal history, Kohlhepp had managed to obtain a real estate license and had built what appeared to be a legitimate business. Behind the professional facade, however, Kohlhepp harbored dark fantasies and dangerous impulses. His property in Woodruff, isolated, heavily wooded, and far from prying eyes, had become the perfect location for activities that no one would ever want discovered. The morning of August 31st, 2016, started like many others for Kayla and Charlie. They woke up in their apartment, shared coffee, and discussed their plans for the day. Kohlhepp had reached out to Kayla with another job offer. This time he needed help at his property in Woodruff. The pay would be good, he assured her, and there was plenty of work to be done. Maintenance, cleaning, general upkeep of the large rural estate. Kayla mentioned the opportunity to Charlie, and they made a decision that would change their lives forever. They would both go. Two sets of hands would get the work done faster, and maybe Kohlhepp would be impressed enough to offer them more regular employment. They needed the money, and this seemed like a straightforward opportunity. Friends and family later reported that Kala and Charlie seemed optimistic that morning. They were excited about the possibility of steady work, about potentially getting ahead financially for the first time in a long while. Kayla texted her mother to let her know they were heading out to do some work for a client. Charlie messaged a friend about potentially getting together later that week once they had some cash in hand. They climbed into their vehicle and drove toward Woodruff, toward Todd Kohlhepp's property, toward a nightmare neither of them could have imagined. They would never be seen alive together again. By the evening of August 31st, Kayla and Charlie hadn't returned home. Their phones went unanswered. Text messages went unread. For the first day, their friends and family tried not to panic. Maybe they had decided to stay over and finish the work the next day. Maybe their phones had died. Maybe there was a simple explanation, but as the hours turned into days, that initial concern transformed into full-blown terror. This wasn't like Kayla. This wasn't like Charlie. They always checked in. They always let someone know where they were. The silence was deafening, and it felt wrong in a way that was impossible to articulate, but impossible to ignore. On September 2nd, just 2 days after the couple had vanished, Kayla's mother filed a missing persons report with the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office. She provided investigators with every detail she could remember about her daughter's plans: the work for Todd Kohlhepp, the property in Woodruff, the optimism in Kayla's voice during their last conversation. Charlie's family did the same, desperate for answers, desperate for any information about where their son might be. The investigation began, but in those early days, there was little to go on. Kayla and Charlie had simply vanished, as if they had driven into the wilderness and disappeared into thin air. Investigators attempted to reach Todd Kohlhepp, but he was evasive, offering vague answers about having seen the couple briefly, but claiming they had left his property after just a short time. He provided no useful information, and without concrete evidence of foul play, authorities had little grounds to press further. As September dragged on, the families of Kayla Brown and Charlie Carver organized search parties, distributed missing persons flyers, and begged the public for any information. The local community rallied around them, sharing photos on social media, organizing volunteer search efforts, and keeping the case in the public eye. But as the weeks passed with no sign of the missing couple, hope began to fade. The terrible possibility that they might never be found alive began to settle over everyone who loved them like a suffocating blanket. Just when it seemed like the case had gone completely cold, something bizarre happened, something that would send chills down the spines of everyone following the investigation and transform the case from a simple missing persons matter into something far more sinister. Charlie Carver's Facebook account became active again. On September 3rd, 3 days after the couple's disappearance, a post appeared on Charlie's Facebook page. The message was brief and seemed designed to deflect concern. "I'm okay, just trying to get out of a bad situation. Tell everyone to stop looking for me." The post was jarring. It was the first communication anyone had received from either Kayla or Charlie since they'd vanished, but something about it felt profoundly wrong. Friends and family who knew Charlie well immediately noticed that the writing style didn't match his typical communication patterns. The phrasing was off. The tone was wrong, and perhaps most disturbingly, why would Charlie post on Facebook instead of directly contacting his worried family? But the post continued. Over the following days and weeks, Charlie's Facebook account remained active, posting updates that grew increasingly strange and unsettling. "Me and Kayla are fine. We're trying to get off drugs and need time away from everyone. We need donations to help us through this difficult time. Anyone who wants to help can send money." The posts always maintained the same basic narrative. Charlie and Kayla were fine. They were dealing with personal issues. They needed space, and they needed money. The requests for donations were particularly disturbing. It felt like someone was attempting to financially exploit the situation to profit from the anguish of two families desperately searching for their loved ones. Friends who tried to engage with Charlie through Facebook Messenger received responses, but they were brief, evasive, and didn't sound like him. When pressed for specific details that only the real Charlie would know, the responses became defensive, or the conversation would abruptly end. Kayla's family was horrified. They knew with absolute certainty that these posts were not coming from Charlie or Kayla. The writing was wrong. The requests for money were completely out of character. And most tellingly, why would two people who were supposedly fine and just trying to get clean refuse all direct contact with their families while simultaneously posting public updates on social media? The answer, of course, was obvious to everyone who loved them. Someone else was controlling Charlie's Facebook account. Someone was posting these messages to create the illusion that the couple was alive and well, to deflect law enforcement attention, to buy time. But who and why? And most terrifying of all, if someone was impersonating Charlie on social media, what had really happened to him and Kayla? As the investigation intensified and local news outlets began covering the disappearance of Kayla Brown and Charlie Carver, something even more disturbing emerged. Something that would later be used as evidence of Todd Kohlhepp's involvement and his chilling arrogance. Kohlhepp's own social media activity revealed a pattern of behavior that was as brazen as it was horrifying. He had been actively following the news coverage of the missing couple, liking posts, reacting to updates, and even commenting on articles about their disappearance. Think about that for a moment. A man who, according to later evidence, had murdered Charlie Carver and was holding Kayla Brown captive in a metal shipping container on his property was actively engaging with public discussions about their disappearance. He was inserting himself into the investigation, observing the panic and anguish of their families, and seemingly deriving some perverse satisfaction from watching the chaos unfold. This behavior is characteristic of certain types of violent offenders who feel a need to stay connected to their crimes, to maintain a sense of control over the narrative, and to experience a thrill from their proximity to the investigation without being detected. It's a form of psychological gratification that demonstrates both profound arrogance and a disturbing lack of empathy. Friends of the missing couple noticed Kohlhepp's online activity and found it deeply unsettling. Why would their former employer be so interested in news about their disappearance? Why was he commenting on posts about them? The behavior struck many as inappropriate at best and suspicious at worst, but without concrete evidence, suspicions alone weren't enough for law enforcement to obtain search warrants or make arrests. Kohlhepp continued his normal life, showing properties to clients, maintaining his real estate business, and presenting himself as a concerned community member who hoped the missing couple would be found safe. All while Kayla Brown remained chained in a shipping container on his property, living a nightmare beyond comprehension. As September turned into October, investigators with the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office refused to give up. Detective teams worked tirelessly, following every lead, no matter how small. They analyzed phone records, tracked financial transactions, interviewed witnesses, and painstakingly reconstructed the last known movements of Kayla and Charlie. One of the most promising leads came from cell phone data. Phone records showed that both Kayla's and Charlie's cell phones had been active in the area of Kohlhepp's Woodruff property on August 31st, the day they disappeared. The phones had pinged off cell towers near the property, providing a digital trail that placed them in that specific location. But then the signals had stopped. The phones had either been powered off or destroyed, and their locations could no longer be tracked. This pattern was consistent with foul play. It suggested that something had happened to the couple at or near Kohlhepp's property, and someone had then disabled their phones to prevent tracking. Investigators also focused on the suspicious Facebook activity. By examining IP addresses, login locations, and posting patterns, they determined that the posts on Charlie's account were almost certainly not being made by Charlie himself. The account was being accessed from locations and devices that didn't match Charlie's known patterns, and the posting times didn't align with what would be expected from someone genuinely trying to stay in touch with loved ones. As the evidence mounted, Todd Kohlhepp increasingly became the focus of the investigation. His prior criminal history as a registered sex offender raised red flags. His evasive behavior when questioned about the missing couple was suspicious. His property in Woodruff matched the location data from the couple's cell phones, and his strange social media activity suggested an inappropriate level of interest in the case. By late October, investigators had developed enough probable cause to obtain a search warrant for Kohlhepp's property. They prepared for what they hoped would be a breakthrough in the case, though few dared to hope they would find Kayla and Charlie alive after more than 2 months of silence. The team of Spartanburg County deputies and law enforcement officials who arrived at Todd Kohlhepp's property on November 3rd were prepared for the worst. They expected to find evidence of foul play. They expected, perhaps, to discover burial sites or other grim indications of what had happened to the missing couple. What they didn't expect was to hear someone screaming for help. As officers spread out across the sprawling property, beginning their systematic search, they heard it. A desperate, muffled banging coming from somewhere near the main structures on the property. The sound was followed by a hoarse, barely audible voice. "Help! Please! I'm in here! Help me!" Officers rushed toward the sound, their hearts pounding, hardly daring to believe what they were hearing. They found themselves standing before a large metal shipping container. The the kind typically used for storage on rural properties. The container was secured with a heavy padlock, sealed tight against the outside world. "Kayla? Kayla Brown? Is that you?" An officer called out. Yes, please get me out, please." The voice was raw with desperation, cracking with emotion. Deputies immediately worked to cut through the lock. As they wrenched open the heavy metal door, the scene that greeted them was something out of a horror film. Inside the cramped, dark container was Kayla Brown. She was emaciated, dirty, and chained by the neck to the interior wall of the container. The chain was secured in a way that allowed her limited movement, enough to reach a bucket that had served as her toilet, enough to access the minimal food and water that had kept her alive, but not enough to escape or even stand fully upright for long periods. The container had been Kayla's entire world for 64 days. 64 days of darkness, of terror, of not knowing if she would ever see daylight again. 64 days of praying that someone would find her, that someone would keep looking, that she wouldn't be forgotten in this metal tomb. As officers helped Kayla out of the container, she was visibly shaking, blinking against the November sunlight that must have seemed impossibly bright after so many weeks in darkness. Emergency medical personnel immediately began assessing her condition, providing water and blankets, treating the wounds and injuries that had accumulated during her captivity. But even in her traumatized state, Kayla had information that investigators desperately needed. As she was being prepared for transport to the hospital, she delivered the devastating news that everyone had feared, but hoped wasn't true. "He killed Charlie. Todd shot Charlie. He made me watch. His body is here somewhere. He's buried on the property." Based on Kayla's information and their ongoing search of the property, investigators began the heartbreaking task of searching for Charlie Carver's remains. It didn't take long. On the same day that Kayla was rescued, searchers discovered recently disturbed earth on a remote section of the property. Cadaver dogs confirmed that human remains were present, and excavation began. What investigators unearthed confirmed everyone's worst fears. Charlie Carver's body was found buried in a shallow grave on Todd Kohlhepp's property. The Spartanburg County coroner later determined that Charlie had died from multiple gunshot wounds. According to Kayla's testimony, which she would later provide in more detail, Kohlhepp had shot Charlie shortly after the couple arrived at the property on August 31st. The murder had been sudden, brutal, and calculated. Kayla had been forced to witness her boyfriend's execution before being dragged to the shipping container where she would spend the next 2 months in captivity. The trauma of watching someone she loved being murdered, combined with the psychological torture of her imprisonment, had created wounds that would take years, if ever, to fully heal. For Charlie's family, the discovery brought a terrible kind of closure. The weeks of desperate hope, of clinging to the possibility that maybe, somehow, Charlie was still alive somewhere, came crashing down in the cruelest possible way. Their son, brother, and friend was gone, murdered by a predator who had viewed him as nothing more than an obstacle to be eliminated. With Kayla rescued and Charlie's body recovered, law enforcement turned their full attention to Todd Kohlhepp. He was immediately arrested and charged with kidnapping and murder, but as investigators dug deeper into Kohlhepp's history and his property, they realized that the horror of what had happened to Kayla and Charlie was just the tip of the iceberg. Todd Kohlhepp, it turned out, was responsible for far more than the death of Charlie Carver. He was a serial killer whose crimes stretched back years, whose property had become a graveyard, and whose carefully constructed life as a successful real estate agent had been nothing more than a cover for unspeakable evil. As investigators searched the property more thoroughly, they made additional grim discoveries: more bodies, more graves, more victims who had encountered Kohlhepp and never made it home. During interrogations, Kohlhepp displayed the chilling detachment common to serial offenders. He provided information about his other victims with an unsettling matter-of-factness, describing murders in a way that suggested he viewed them as accomplishments rather than atrocities. One of the most shocking revelations was Kohlhepp's confession to the infamous Superbike Motorsports murders, a quadruple homicide that had occurred in Chesney, South Carolina in 2003. 4 people had been shot to death at a motorcycle shop, and the case had remained unsolved for 13 years. Kohlhepp admitted to being the perpetrator, claiming the murders were motivated by a perceived slight when he had attempted to return a motorcycle. 4 people executed over a customer service dispute. The banality of the motive was almost as chilling as the act itself. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including Kayla Brown's eyewitness testimony and the physical evidence recovered from his property, Todd Kohlhepp eventually pleaded guilty to 7 counts of murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and 1 count of sexual assault. The decision to plead guilty spared the victims' families, including Kayla Brown, from the additional trauma of a lengthy trial. It also allowed prosecutors to secure life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that Kohlhepp would never again walk free. In court, Kohlhepp showed little remorse. He provided details about his crimes in a clinical, detached manner that suggested he viewed the proceedings as more of an inconvenience than a reckoning for the lives he had destroyed. This lack of empathy only reinforced what investigators had already concluded. Kohlhepp was a dangerous psychopath who had found satisfaction in controlling and destroying the lives of others. For the families of his victims, the sentencing brought a measure of justice, but no real peace. How could there be peace when their loved ones were gone? How could any punishment truly account for the magnitude of what had been taken from them? Charlie Carver's family attended the proceedings, their grief visible and raw. They had lost a beloved son and brother to a monster who had viewed him as disposable. No sentence, no amount of time in prison could ever bring Charlie back or heal the wound his absence had left in their lives. Kayla Brown's rescue and survival is nothing short of miraculous. She had endured 64 days of captivity in conditions that would have broken many people. She had witnessed the murder of someone she loved. She had been chained, assaulted, and psychologically tortured. She had every reason to give up hope, to surrender to despair, to believe that she would die in that container. But Kayla survived. She survived through sheer willpower, through refusing to let Todd Kohlhepp take everything from her, through holding on to the belief that someone, somewhere, was still looking for her. In the aftermath of her rescue, Kayla faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding her life. The physical injuries healed relatively quickly, but the psychological trauma was profound. She suffered from PTSD, nightmares, and survivor's guilt. Why had she lived when Charlie had died? What could she have done differently? The questions haunted her, even though she knew, rationally, that she had been a victim, that nothing that happened was her fault. Kayla has since spoken publicly about her experience, becoming an advocate for victims of violent crime, and working to raise awareness about the dangers that can lurk behind seemingly normal facades. Her courage in sharing her story has inspired countless others who have survived trauma, showing them that it is possible to reclaim your life even after experiencing unimaginable horror. The case of Kayla Brown and Charlie Carver raises profound questions about how predators like Todd Kohlhepp can operate undetected in our communities. How does a registered sex offender with a violent criminal history obtain a real estate license? How does someone maintain a successful business while simultaneously committing serial murders? What warning signs were missed and what systems failed? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're necessary ones. Kohlhepp's ability to present himself as a respectable businessman while harboring such dark impulses speaks to the limitations of background checks, monitoring systems, and community awareness. It reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it wears a business suit and drives a nice car, and offers you work when you desperately need it. The case also highlights the importance of trusting our instincts. Multiple people who interacted with Kohlhepp reported feeling that something was off about him, that there was something unsettling in his demeanor or his behavior. But in the absence of concrete evidence, those feelings were dismissed or ignored. We live in a society that values politeness and giving people the benefit of the doubt. But sometimes those instincts that tell us something is wrong are worth listening to. For Kayla and Charlie, those instincts may have been present, but they were overridden by economic necessity. They needed work, they needed money, and Kohlhepp offered both. The tragedy is that desperation can make us vulnerable to predators who are skilled at identifying and exploiting that vulnerability. In the midst of focusing on Kala's survival and Kohlhepp's crimes, it's important to remember Charlie Carver, not as a victim, but as a person. Charlie was someone with dreams, with people who loved him, with a life that had value. Beyond the circumstances of his death, those who knew Charlie remember his kindness, his struggles, and his determination to build a better life. They remember his love for motorcycles, his gentle spirit, and his belief in second chances. They remember the way he cared for Kala, the way he supported her, the way he faced life's challenges with resilience, even when things were hard. Charlie's death was a tragedy, not just because of how it happened, but because of everything that was lost. All the possibilities, all the future moments he'll never experience, all the love he had left to give. His family and friends continue to honor his memory, refusing to let Todd Kohlhepp's actions define who Charlie was. The story of Kayla Brown and Charlie Carver is one of the darkest chapters in South Carolina's criminal history. It's a reminder that evil exists, that predators walk among us, and that tragedy can strike when we least expect it. But it's also a story about survival, about the power of the human spirit to endure unimaginable trauma and emerge on the other side. It's about law enforcement officers who refused to give up, who followed leads until they found answers, who saved a life by not accepting that Kayla and Charlie had simply vanished. It's about families who never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, never stopped demanding justice for their loved ones. And ultimately, it's about the importance of remembering Kayla's courage, remembering Charlie's life, remembering all the victims of violence whose stories deserve to be told and whose memories deserve to be honored. Kayla Brown survived 64 days in hell. She emerged broken but not defeated. She has rebuilt her life piece by piece, refusing to let Todd Kohlhepp take anything more from her than he already has. That is the final word in this story, not Kohlhepp's crimes, not the horror of what happened, but Kayla's survival and her refusal to be defined by the worst thing that ever happened to her. In the face of absolute evil, she chose to live. And in that choice, there is hope for all of us. Take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and the algorithm gods will make sure you don't miss any future uploads.